Welcome everyone. This is session 2 on budget for the 2023 Community Project Funding Cohort. Thank you for joining us today. We're going to go through some logistics just to get started. I know there are still some folks rolling in through the waiting room, so just some reminders about logistics on our session. So everyone is muted during this webinar. You do have the opportunity to participate in the chat, which we'll go over in just a moment, but muting everyone will keep down on the noise level, the background noise. So thanks for understanding. This PowerPoint presentation, along with the recording, will be available on the HUD Exchange following this session. It does take a few days to get posted, but you can access it there, and you should have already received the slides for this session. Again, if you would like to participate in today's session, which we strongly encourage, please use the chat function. You can submit content-related questions using the chat feature. So reminder that on your main toolbar, there is a little speech bubble. You click on that, it'll open the chat box. You can drop any of your questions in there, and we will answer them as we get to them. We will be stopping throughout the presentation to take questions on some of the material we've just delivered, but there's also a general Q&A at the end. So anything that's on your mind, go ahead and drop it in the chat. If for some reason we can't get to everyone's question today, we will log the questions so that we can follow up with you to get you an answer. So don't be shy about the things you need to ask. Go ahead and drop it into the chat. So for today, I'm just going to go over the agenda. So we're going to do some introductions in just a moment. We're also going to provide an overview of the cohort series. This is only session 2, so we just want to get everybody reoriented to the purpose for the cohort. We are going to provide a brief recap of session 1. Session 1 was on the narrative component of your materials, and so we're going to just give you a quick recap of what everyone learned during that session in case you missed it or you need a refresher. You can always refer back to the slides if you want more detail on any of the recap items that we go over today. Then we're going to get into today's content, which of course is budget. So we'll be giving a budget overview. We will also talk about both construction and non-construction projects and talk about line items within budgets for those types of projects, including determining amounts. We're going to go over how you do amendments. This is something that you won't probably have to think about for a bit, but many people will likely need to amend their budgets at some point in the process. So we'll talk about what that process would look like. And then another item that you won't have to think about for a short time here is DRGR, but eventually you will have to use DRGR. You will set up budgets in DRGR, which is why we're including that topic in this presentation. And you'll also use DRGR to draw your funds. So it's very important, although something that's a little farther off, but we want to give you a kind of high-level overview of what it's going to look like. And then, of course, we have a general Q&A time at the end, but we'll be taking questions throughout today's presentation. So on to introductions. So my name's Jennifer Alpha. I'm with TDA Consulting. I've been with TDA Consulting for about 12 years, but I've been doing community development work for over 2 decades. And I work on a variety of programs, but for CPF, I've been focusing on the budget cohort series, in cohort sessions in the series, as well as the form session. So I'll see you all again in a few weeks when we cover the last session, which is forms. With that, I'll turn it over to my co-presenter, Stan.
Hi, I'm Stan Fitterman with TDA as well. I have about 25 years of experience in community and economic development, as well as development of affordable rental housing. And I've been working on the budget cohort and also been doing as a co-presenter as well on the environmental review one. So I may run into y'all later on that one.
Great.
And then I think, I was just going to, yes, go ahead, Jennifer.
Oh, yeah, no. So we have some HUD guests as well on the call. So Chantal, would you like to say hello?
Sure, thank you. Hi, everybody. For those of you that joined our narrative session, welcome back to the cohort. For those of you that hadn't, thanks for attending our second session, the budget session. My name is Chantel James, the Deputy Director of the Congressional Grants Division. Again, we're really happy to offer these resources to our grantees. And we also have two grant officers on this session, Shayna Glover and Ramel Calderwood. And we're just going to sit in and be happy to answer any questions that you may have to make sure that you understand how to complete your grant package. Thanks again for joining. Shayna, would you like to introduce yourself? If you can unmute.
You might have to unmute that. So let me scroll to the bottom. Shayna.
Ramel, are you able to unmute?
I am. Thank you, Chantel. Hi, everybody. My name is Ramel Calderwood. I'm one of the CPF grant officers, and I cover the states of Alaska, Oregon, and Washington. I'll hand it back to Chantel or Connor.
I think Connor's doing the environmental review one because we have two going at the same time. So I think we're Connorless.
Yeah, busy day for cohorts. Great. Well, thank you all for providing that introduction. We are going to move on now to get to know you all a little bit better, those of you participating in this cohort. We won't take the time to go over around the full room. We've got about 60 folks joining us today, but we do have some polls that we would like to have you participate in so that we can better understand where y'all are at in the process. All right, so let me go ahead and get that started. Okay, so our first question, where are you in the grant award process? Are you just starting to work on your application packet? Have you submitted your packet, but you've been asked to revise it? Or are you waiting on your grant agreement, which really should be a longer statement, which is you've submitted your packet, it's been approved, you know, and or you haven't heard any comments that need revisions, and now you're waiting on your grant agreement. So basically you're almost at the end. That's what letter C is for. So we'll give folks a few seconds here to answer. About 2/3 of the folks answered so far. I'll give you a few more seconds. Okay, it looks like the majority of folks, so over 80% of you, are just starting to work on your application packet. And that is understandable because this cohort series is here to help you through that process of assembling your materials. So thank you for being here. And for those of you who have already started, great work. We may be able to help you with some lingering questions you have, or if you're in the process of making revisions, we can help clarify some of that as well. So thanks for answering those questions. All right, on to our next poll question. One second. All right. Next question. Have you received federal funds in the past? Yes or no? Give everybody a few more seconds. Everybody answered that one super quickly. All right, interesting on this one. So on this one, it looks like about 65% of folks have received federal funds in the past, which I think is a higher percentage than we've had in other sessions. So this is good to hear. It helps us to understand what your background is when it comes to using federal dollars, because obviously there's a lot of compliance items that you have to keep in mind when you use federal funds. So thanks for answering that question. All right, on to the next one. Have you drafted your budget? Yes or no? So have you already started thinking about your budget? We know that most of you are just starting to put your materials together, but have you gotten to your budget yet? All right. Give you a couple more seconds. Okay. So on this one, we're a little more half and half on this one. It looks like about half of you have started, about 47% have started, and 53% have not started yet. So we got a good mix of folks who are just at the beginning and those of you who may have been thinking about this for a bit of time. All right, and on our last get to know you full question, we are just wondering if you've signed up for the HUD Exchange mailing list, specifically for the CPF program. So on the HUD Exchange, there are lots of different mailing lists you can sign up for, and we're wondering if you have gotten to sign up for the CPF mailing list yet. Looks a few more seconds to complete this question. All right, so on this one, it looks like most of you have signed up. Again, a little higher percentage on this one than in previous sessions. So I think we've got perhaps a pretty knowledgeable group here, Stan. They seem to know just where to go for things. So for those of you who haven't signed up yet, though, if you're not, we're about to show you how you can do that. All right. Thank you all. Thank you for taking the time to participate in those polls. It's really helpful for us to understand how each of the cohorts are, how they're doing in the process and what their background might be. Helps us to tailor the conversation a little bit. So thanks for that. So on the HUD Exchange website, for those of you who haven't received federal funds before, the HUD Exchange is a wonderful resource of information for understanding the CPF program, getting more guidance on specific topics within CPF, and requesting support. So on this slide here, you can this is just a little screenshot of the CPF page on the HUD Exchange. The web address is there at the bottom. You can get program support through a series of avenues, which we're going to go over here in just a moment. But you can also see that there is links for policy documents, and then various links to help you through the different systems that you'll need to use. So one of the resources for support is the Ask a Question. So Ask a Question is a way for you to submit a question through the HUD Exchange. That question goes to folks knowledgeable about CPF, and then they can answer that question for you in just a matter of days or route it to the person who can help you get an answer. So definitely Ask a Question is a great way going forward if you have any inquiries that you want to make outside of even this cohort program. In addition, this screen provides you with a screenshot on signing up for the mailing list. So we asked, did you sign up for the mailing list in that last poll question? And about 30-ish% of you had not signed up yet. I strongly encourage those who have not signed up to do so. You can go to the HUD Exchange and just type in mailing list. There's also the web link there on the slide. But when you get to this mailing list subscription page, you can see all the different programs where HUD has mailing lists. So there are many. So if you are doing any other HUD programs, make sure you sign up for those mailing lists too. But for our purposes, you want to go to the EDI-CPF, Community Project Funding Grants box, click that box, and then fill out the fields so that you can get all of the latest information delivered right to your mailbox. This will allow you to stay on top of any new guidance documents that are coming out, any additional trainings and things like that. So definitely head there after this webinar to sign up for the mailing list. Okay. So moving on then to our cohort overview. Now, obviously, the cohorts, as you know, are designed to assist CPF grantees with completing any of the required materials for the grant execution and project initiation of your CPF program. This cohort is delivered over 4 sessions. And so the first session was on project narrative, as we've mentioned earlier. Today's session is on budget. There will be an office hours that will follow this budget session, and that's where you can bring more of your detail-oriented questions. We'll be able to have more verbal conversation. So definitely take some time today as we go through to think about any additional more in-depth questions you might want to bring to office hours, but that will happen on February 27th. And then on March 5th, we have the environmental session, and on March 19th, we have the session on forms. And then that will conclude our cohort series. So just to give you a quick recap on the narrative session, which, as I've noted, has already been completed. That was session 1. Your narrative that you're going to pull together for your packet materials is going to include some key sections. These sections are not in any prescribed format. So you can choose the format that you present your information in, but you do need these key sections. You're going to need a project description, project metrics, a project timeline and status, and then a description of any proposed use of subrecipients. And so we'll talk about each of those just real briefly here. So for project descriptions, your project description has to match the Joint Explanatory Statement, or the JES, unless it's been corrected or amended. And you want to describe all the actions that are going to be undertaken as part of your projects, regardless of the funding source. So you're going to describe your entire project in your project description, even the parts that are not being funded with CPF. For your metrics, you want to have clearly stated goals and outcomes for your project. And this is going to include any Section 3 metrics that, if Section 3 is triggered as part of your project. So where Section 3 is triggered, you're going to have metrics for your total labor hours and your Section 3 targeted labor hours. So be thinking about your goals and outcomes for your project, and that's what goes in the metrics section. With respect to timeline, you're going to provide an explanation of where your project is in the lifespan. So we know that some of these projects were envisioned even before you knew about your CPF grant. So you want to describe where you're at in the lifespan of this project. You also want to provide estimated start and end times for your project, and describe any steps that have been taken towards your environmental review. As we've talked about earlier, environmental review is session number 3 of this cohort series. So you'll be learning more about that in the coming weeks. But you're going to describe where you're at with environmental review as part of your timeline discussion in your narrative. And then finally, subrecipients. You want to describe why a project is best implemented with subrecipients if you're using them. And you're going to describe the roles and the scope for each subrecipient that you're using, if you're using them. So those are the 4 components of the narrative: description, metrics, timeline and status, and proposed use of subrecipients. Again, there's no prescribed format for this narrative, but you want to make sure that you're covering all those topics. If you'd like more detail on any of these items, you can always find that information in the CPF grant guide, which we'll be mentioning again and again throughout this session and the other cohort sessions as well. But definitely, if you have not reviewed that grant guide yet, it's a really good idea. There's lots of great detail in there that will help you walk through this process. And then, of course, there are the session slides that you can review from the narrative session that was held a couple weeks ago. All right, and with that, we will jump into our budget discussion. So I'm going to go ahead and stop sharing my screen so that Stan can share his.
All right, thank you. Let me get. All right. All right. Thank you, Jennifer. And I trust everyone's seeing the PowerPoint. Let's see. How's that?
Yes, now I see
All
it.
right. Okay. I forgot to click from current slide. All right. Thank you. So let's talk about the basics of the budget. So as many of you are aware, we have to submit a line item budget with our grant agreement. We're going to get to what those line items might look like in a second. But on that budget, we have to include the uses for the entire project. And we need to basically have two columns, one that has our CPF amount for each line item and the non-CPF amounts for the line items. The total amount of the CPF funds we show must equal the CPF award. So round up, round down, do what you need to do, but the amount of CPF funds we show on our budget has to equal the amount of our CPF award. Okay. Our budget needs to be consistent with what we have in the project narrative and with what we have in the joint explanatory statement, the JES. So for example, if our project narrative says we're going to build for use CP money to build something, but we don't have a line, then we have to have a line item in our budget for construction because we're building something. If we're going to say that, or we're going to pay for services and pay for staff, we need to have a line item for the personnel. So the grant officers need to be able to look at our budget and determine that it is consistent with our narrative. We also have to make sure our narrative, our budget is consistent with the JES. We've got where it is here, a link, and y'all have the presentation. HUD recipients begin on that page there, the S9406. And that JES, as many of you know, doesn't have a whole lot of information. But again, if the JES says money to build a community center, then our budget needs to show that we're actually going to be using that money to build a community center or whatever the use is. Whatever we were funded to do, our budget needs to show that it's going to accomplish that. Okay. We can create our own budget format. There is no mandatory format that the budget has to be in. It can be in Excel or Google Sheets, whatever version of a spreadsheet you use, or it can be a Word or a Google Doc or any other document that you create, any other software you need. We also can use the forms from grants.gov. So there's the 424B, which is for created for non-construction programs. There's 424D, which we're going to look at both of those in a minute, but that's for construction programs. It's very possible if you're doing construction and non-construction in the same project that you would have line items from both of those forms. So it's not like if it can only be non-construction or it can only be construction. That's how these forms that have already been approved by HUD that we can use were set up. But as you are getting into your specifics project, you may need to use some line items from both. So we'll take a look in a minute. But before we do that, it's time for a poll. So Jennifer, I'm going to have to rely on you for the polls, if that's all right.
Absolutely. Let me just get to my full screen here.
Does it?
Okay. So going back here. Can you see the poll?
I can, yeah.
Okay.
Hopefully,
Okay.
people are seeing it. So, budget, true or false? The budget must include uses for the entire project with the CPF and non-CPF funds identified separately. All right, another 5 seconds. Okay. So that is true. The budget has to, and 98% of you got that right. Good job. The budget must include uses for the entire project, and we've got to identify the CPF funds and the non-CPF funds separately. So we're going to have 2 columns, one that says CPF funds, one that says non-CPF funds. All right, good work.
Okay, question number 2 here.
Okay. So the forms, the SF 424 forms for budgets for construction and non-construction may be used as a template, must be used as a template, or cannot be used as a template. Okay. All right, we got about the same percentage participating so far. So they may be used as a template. So A is the correct answer. There are not required forms for the budget, and there's no prohibition about using these forms as our budget template. So they may be used, but we do not have to. All right, good work.
Got one more poll for you.
One more poll, all righty. All right, so true or false, the budget does not need to be consistent with the narrative nor the JES, provided the budget includes an explanation of the differences. Okay, we're holding on 74%. So that could not be more wrong. The budget has to be consistent with the narrative, and it has to be consistent with the JES. That's how HUD is going to review your grant officers and other HUD staff. That's how they're reviewing the budget. Is it consistent with the narrative and consistent with the JES? So that is a false statement. It has to be consistent with your narrative, has to be consistent with the joint explanatory statement.
Yep.
All right, thank you. Thank you, Jennifer.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay. All right, so there's a sample format and sample line items for the construction budget. This is the 424 form that we have added the CPF funds and non-CPF funds column to. One of the things we want you to do between now and the office hours next week is we have these forms available to you on Excel in the Absorb, the system you use to sign up for this class. I believe they'll also be emailed to you. We'd like you before office hours next week to start working on your budget and bring any questions you have with you to the office hours as you're going through this. So in addition to having these forms in Excel format, we've also got a couple of Word files that give the instructions for each line item. So we're just going to go through them briefly here. Administrative and legal expenses. You know, if you're buying property, you're going to have an attorney. If you're setting up a partnership, a limited partnership, you're going to have an attorney. You're going to have legal fees. Any administrative cost of your own staff that you're charging to the program would be put on this line item. If you're buying something, land, a building, right-of-ways, easements, less likely, but land buildings, that's a lot of folks are buying land or buying structures. All the cost of acquisition, including appraisals, surveys, the cost associated with acquiring, any legal costs legal costs would be in the line item above, but any other cost that you would incur as a result of buying this property. Title work would be in this. If we are buying somewhere that is occupied and we are going to relocate people that are living there, this is where we put our relocation expenses. It would also be where to put, if we're buying a building that's occupied by a business and we have to pay to relocate the business, we would also put that in this line item. Architectural and engineering fees, we're going to get those amounts from estimates of what we believe our architects and our engineers are going to cost us. There's also a line item for other architectural engineer fees. These are services that architects or engineers may perform, such as studies or reports that are not architectural engineering, but they're still done by the same firms. If we're constructing something or rehabbing something, there's more than likely going to be inspections. If we have other lenders involved or other funders involved, they may have a system where they require inspections. We, as the owner of the project, are going to want someone who represents us to do project inspections before we allow someone to make a draw, to make sure the work's being done to our standards and that what they're billing us for has actually been done. So that's where we'd put our inspection fees. Site work, you always have to do site work when you're doing new construction. Sometimes when you're doing rehab, this would be clearing, grading, getting the parking lot in place, any geotech work, soil test could be here. If we're knocking something down and getting rid of it, demolition and removal is this line item. Construction, this is where we put how much the construction contract's going to be. Hard and soft costs can go in here as well for the general conditions, and the construction cost would go here. If there's any equipment we're buying for this project, that would go on line 10. Anything we haven't identified on these line items 1 through 10, but is going to be a line item for the project, can go in miscellaneous. And what you would do here is put a description of what the miscellaneous line item is. We're then going to subtotal everything. And then we have contingencies. Even with new construction and with rehab, things go wrong. And as a result, things that we can't predict. So as a result, usually the standard is 5% of construction hard cost and 5% of soft cost as contingencies for new construction. A kind of an industry norm for rehab is 10% contingency for rehab, because there may be more things that are likely we don't see until we remove a wall or lift up some floorboards. We have the subtotal of that, and then if we have expecting any project or program income that we would use to offset the cost, that's unlikely, but it's still a possibility. We then subtract that from the subtotal, and we have our total project cost. Now, this is an example of what the non-construction, some of the non-construction charges would be. So personnel, we figure out what our hourly or annual wages are for the personnel that are going to work in this project. If someone's only going to do 25% of their time on this CPF funded project, then we would get what their personnel cost is and multiply that by 0.25 or divide by 4. So we would apply the percentage that they're going to spend on this project. That's what we're going to put in our budget. Fringe benefits, 2 CFR Part 200 is the administrative cost guidance from HUD or for all federal programs. And they have very specific language on how what counts as fringe benefits, but it's retirement, FICA, health insurance, paid time off. And we would calculate what all the costs of those are: unemployment compensation, workers' compensation. So we would factor all that in. And again, once we get the total amount, if someone's only working 25% of their time on this project, we would charge 25% of their fringe benefits to this project. Travel, fairly straightforward. If it's going to involve travel, any equipment, any supplies, If we were going to hire a subcontractor to do any of the work, any contracts we would have, we would list what specifically they are. Anything that hasn't been charged, and we haven't identified here, we'll have the total direct charges, which is A through G. Any indirect charges, we're going to talk about in just a second what those are. And then the sum of H and I, total direct charges and indirect charges, is our total cost. So let's talk about indirect costs for a second. So indirect costs are those that are benefit more than one cost objective, and we can't really assign them to the cost objective specifically to a project without an enormous amount of effort that just isn't worth it. So accounting. If we are part of a local government, we have a finance department that does the whole local government. Sure, we could tell the finance department, we want you to count up the number of entries that you make for the CPF fund, and we want you to divide that number by the total number of entries you do for the entire city, and we're going to take that percent and charge your time to that, which is an awful lot of work that for something that's not readily assigned to the project. And that would take a lot of effort that's way disproportionate to the results achieved. So we have two options here. One, if you've already gotten a federally negotiated cost rate, which I'm guessing most of you don't, but if you do, you can use your federally negotiated indirect cost rate for this grant. If you don't, which I'm guessing would be most of you, then you can use an indirect cost. You can use, the de minimis rate of 10% of the modified total direct cost. And that modified total direct cost is most of your project cost. There are a couple of things that don't count that are laid out in the section we've identified here. It's 2 CFR Part 200.414. So again, if costs that are not easily assigned to a cost center, personnel, accounting, rent for an entire building, maybe security for that building, things like that cannot be easily assigned to the project, we can use 10% of the modified total direct cost, which is most of our grant. There are a few exceptions. Okay, for additional information on indirect cost, here's the website that we can use. The link is here, and there is on this page CPF supplemental information on indirect cost. It's kind of hidden by that blue arrow, but that we click on that, and we've got more direction from HUD on using the de minimis rate and what indirect costs are. Right. After we have our budget approved by HUD. So we've gone through this process. Those of you that haven't done your budget, you've got your budget, your grant agreement is signed, you are implementing your project, and life is good. Occasionally, after we have our budget done and approved, we may need to revise it. A line item may have come in for less than we thought. Something may be come in more than we thought that's not being covered by contingency. We're going to move money from one item to another. That is permitted. We need to submit in order to amend a budget. And remember, this is after we have gotten our grant agreement and our budget's been approved. We would submit a revised budget and a letter on our letterhead telling our grant officer why they need to approve our budget amendment. Their letter needs to include the justification, why we need to do the change, a detailed explanation of how it's still consistent with congressional intent, still consistent with the JES, and an explanation of why the change is needed. Now, while we're doing the budget amendment process, we can continue to make draws on line items that are unaffected by this change, but we can't be reimbursed for the new line items until our grant officers reviewed and approved our budget. All right, I think with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Jennifer, but do we want to pause for any questions, Jennifer?
Yeah, there's some questions here. I can read them
Okay.
off.
Are there ones we can answer?
I think so.
Oh, good. Okay.
Okay. So questions. Oh, there's a few more that roll that have come in. Is an amendment required if non-CPF funding line item amounts change?
No, unless it's going to change the amount. We're, happy for someone from HUD to jump in, but if it's going to just change, it's the CPF line items that would need to be changed. They need HUD approval. Is that right, Chantel or Romel?
So this is Ramel. I'm one of the grant officers. I'll take a stab at that. The amendment request letter would not be needed, but for me as a grant officer, I would like to get the updated revised project budget regardless. So if you're adding or changing non-CPF supported line items, I'd still like a for me at least, I would like a copy of that.
The whole thing. Okay.
Yeah, and I think, some of this goes back to probably has like a DRGR connection, which we're going to talk about DRGR in a moment. But in DRGR, you're going to set up a budget, but that budget is specific to your CPF funds. And so that is going to require an amendment if you change anything with your CPF funds. But like Romel was saying, if you're going to change anything else within the financing, it's good to let your grant officer know. But the formal amendment process for your budget, you will have to make that in DRGR in order for you to properly access your funds. Okay. Okay, so for a non-construction project, so this would be planning and a feasibility analysis, are architectural and engineering testing expenses eligible?
Well, sure, if they're related to the project. So I guess would want to know what the architectural and engineering expenses would be if you're not doing any construction. But if they're related to the project, I guess what I want you to folks not to get hung up on is the forms that are created in grants.gov that have been there for for years are ones that we can use for the CPF program. They were designed to be construction and non-construction because that's how things are mostly funded. We're going to be doing things that are construction and non-construction on the same deal. We would have line items from both of those formats. That's fine. So I guess really, if you're not doing construction at all, but you still, for whatever reason, have architectural and engineering that are related to the project, then yes, that would be something that would be an allowable expense for the CPF funds. Again, it's got to be consistent with the narrative, consistent with what you told Congress you wanted to do.
Yes, thank you. So this question asks, for equipment, is there a definition or cost basis? If it is in the GC contract, does it get broken out? For example, HVAC system.
No, that's part of construction. This would be equipment that you're buying that's standalone. And I apologize if I didn't go through that, but if it's I've got to go back, but I believe it's $5,000. Things that are less than $5,000. Let's see here. Anyways, things that are less than $5,000 are supplies. So that means that a computer is not equipment, unless your agency's policies require a lower amount. So if anything that's low, if your policies say anything that's $2,500 or more is equipment, then you follow your own policies. If not, you can follow the federal guidelines, which is $5,000. So anything less than $5,000 is supplies. Anything more than $5,000 that's going to last more than a year is equipment.
Thank you for that clarification. Several people asked for the direct link to the SF424 forms. And so I have dropped that direct link into the chat for anybody who is searching for that. And then I think this question relates to the SF424 forms. They asked the classifications that you were talking about earlier, are they already identified in the example forms? Although maybe they're referencing the example spreadsheets that we talked about being in Absorb. So if Terry, if this doesn't answer your question, please go ahead and just follow up on that question so that we can get the details of what you are hoping to understand better. So as you know, as Dan has talked about, there isn't a specific format that you have to use for the budget. These are just some options using the SF424, taking a look at the examples that are in Absorb, but there isn't a strict format that you need to use. So you're going to have to think about your project and the types of costs that you have and just make sure that they're all represented in the budget.
All right, are you ready to take over?
Yeah, sure. But also on the forms, just a little tip on the forms. I know some folks have trouble opening those forms because I'm not exactly sure of the technical reasons for it, but I know that sometimes it's hard to get those forms to open just off of grants.gov. I find I have the best luck if I download them and save them and then go and open them from Adobe. So go into Adobe and then find them on your computer where you've downloaded and saved them and then open them. That seems to be my most successful method for getting those forms open, if that's helpful to anyone.
And I've had the same problem too.
Yeah. So just a little tip.
Sorry, Jennifer. So this is Ramel. If I can just chime in regards to the format.
Yeah, go ahead.
So I know that we don't have a particular a recommendation on the format, but as a grant officer, I have seen and received project budgets with quite a lot of line items, 50 plus, and they're like in a PDF or Word. Unfortunately, it is difficult to calculate that. As a grant officer, I prefer that if it's going to be a project budget with quite a lot of line items, I would prefer an Excel sheet just because it is easier to calculate the line items, because we need to make sure that the total adds up to your CPF grant amount.
Mm-hmm. Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, that's very good. And also it's going to make the process go faster because your grant officers would have to pause, get out a calculator, add everything up. So just if we can make things a little bit easier for our grant officers, it'll also help things go faster in terms of getting you to approval.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. One quick question that I saw here that we didn't get to, are indirect costs required to include?
No, you can include them, but there's no requirement that you have to charge. I mean, a lot of, especially local governments, want to get reimbursed for for extra work done by the departments such like personnel and finance. So it's allowable, but it's not required.
Mm-hmm. Yes. Okay. Someone else asked, is there a required match requirement for this program?
No, I mean, if you put into if the JES says that it requires it, which I don't know, I haven't looked at all of them, but I don't know if there's any that actually, the JES requires a match, but if it's not in there, then no.
Great. All righty. I think we have all the questions. If we somehow missed your question, please flag it for us. All right, I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
All right.
Oh, 1 second here. Do this in a way that makes it easier for everyone to see it. Haven't done it yet, so you're not missing anything. Okay, here we go. How about now? Can you see it, Stan?
Sorry, I was on mute. Yes, perfect.
Okay, great. Great. So we're gonna just talk a little bit about DRGR. Remember at the very beginning of today's session, I mentioned that for DRGR, this is something you're not gonna have to think about immediately. You won't have to deal with this until you get your executed grant agreement back and HUD gets you set up and started in DRGR. But eventually you will have to go into DRGR. DRGR is the Disaster Recovery Grant Reporting System. That's what it stands for. Some folks on other sessions have asked, well, why are we using a disaster recovery system if we're CPF grants? DRGR actually is the platform for about a dozen different HUD programs. It just started as the platform for disaster recovery. So it still bears that name, but it is used for a variety of HUD programs. And so in DRGR, this is basically where you are going to process your vouchers so that you can access your funds. And it's also where you're going to be doing your reporting. So those are the two primary functions of DRGR, basically, where you make your draws, where you report on your accomplishments. But for the purposes of this session and talking about budget, we wanted to describe how you set up your projects and activities in DRGR, because that's where you're going to be establishing the budget from which you will create obligations, from which you will make your draws. And so in DRGR, the budget structure is a hierarchy. You can think about it like these little stacking dolls that you see here on the screen. So your total budget in DRGR is the sum of your grant. And if you're going to have any program income, which I think most of these grants are not, but if you were, your grant plus program income is your total budget. And that's your biggest pot of money. From there, the system goes down into projects. So projects are established, and then within the projects live all the activities. Projects are really like buckets that hold the activities. The activities are where all the detail lives in DRGR. So in DRGR, the activity level is where we're going to talk about our narratives in great detail. It's where we're going to draw our funds. It's where we're going to report on our accomplishments. So the activity level is the most active level of DRGR. I think for most CPF grants, you're probably just going to have one project and then you're going to have the activities within that project. But there are a variety of ways to set things up. The CPF team is doing a wonderful job of providing DRGR guidance already. There are already videos on the HUD Exchange for working with DRGR, and we're going to go over those here in just a moment. But there will be even more DRGR guidance forthcoming, so keep an eye on that. Sign up for the mailing list so that you get all the all the hot off the presses guidance documents. But this screenshot here gives you just a visual illustration of the hierarchy of how the funds are managed in DRGR. So grant level, then your projects, then your activities, and then at the activity level, we're creating obligations and we're making draws. All right, so setting up your projects and your activities in DRGR is going to require you to establish budgets in the system, and these budgets will obviously track whatever you've submitted as part of your materials to get your grant agreement executed. And so there, as I mentioned, on the HUD Exchange, there is a DRGR quick guide already. There are also step-by-step videos for setting up projects and activities for CPF grants. So this is just a quick little screenshot to show you what the setup screen looks like for projects, but there's lots more guidance on the HUD Exchange. So as you can see, you're going to enter some setup information that includes the project number and title and a description. You're going to give it a status, and then most importantly for our conversation, you're going to set the budget. And then you're going to set up an activity or activities that get associated to the project. As part of setting up your activities, you're always going to associate each activity to a project. Remember, they stack within each other. So you're going to have your activity types, your activity numbers, your descriptions. Again, all the detail is really living at the activity level in DRGR. And then you're going to establish a budget here as well. And this budget is the budget from which you'll be making your draws for each activity. So as I mentioned, there are lots of guidance documents on the HUD Exchange for DRGR generally, but the CPF team is doing a great job at tailoring the DRGR guidance specifically for CPF grantees. And there are some videos already populated on the HUD Exchange. We've got how you submit your action plan, how you add activities. Responsible organizations are the organizations that will carry out the activities, and you have to establish those as part of your activity setup. So there's a video on responsible orgs, establishing projects, setting up performance and accomplishment measures. In DRGR, you establish your proposed performance measures and accomplishment measures. And then when it comes to reporting time, you're going to report on your actuals. So that video would walk you through that process. And then this number 6 here, how to add and change users. So you will have one user set up for you by HUD, and then anyone else who needs to work on the grant in DRGR will need to be set up by that user that's given initial access in DRGR. So just for thinking ahead planning purposes, you are going to need at least 2 individuals with DRGR access, because one person will create a voucher for the draw and another person will need to approve the voucher. It has to be 2 separate human beings. So just think ahead, you're going to need at least 2 folks who have access. We always recommend a backup for each of those roles if you're able, if you have enough staff, but at least 2. All right, and then there's a video on how you can add and change your users. Okay, so that's just your high-level overview of DRGR. We certainly know that there's a lot more to learn than that, but that kind of gives you an idea of what's to come. And let's see, I see a few new chats rolling in here. So
All right. We got one of them answered. Thank you, Ms.
Great.
Glover, for that.
all right.
And I wanted to remind everyone for the office hours next week, we'd like for you to start working on your budget and bring your budget questions to the office hours.
Absolutely. The office hours is going to be an opportunity for you to ask your more detailed questions. So take what you learned today. And for those of you who have not started your budget yet, because we had a little chunk of folks who had not started, I think it was about half and half, I think. And so if you haven't started yet, start thinking about it, because that will trigger some questions that you have in your mind, and then you can bring those to the office hours session and get some, real-time advice on how to manage any questions you have about building out your budget. So definitely do some homework between now and next week. If you have the time, that would be super beneficial. All right. I think we've gotten through the questions that were asked, and we're just about at time. So let me go ahead and just do the last few slides here. Evaluations are super important for us. We're only halfway through the cohort series, so this is a great time to give us your feedback. We'd love your feedback after every session. It helps us improve as we go forward, but particularly now, because we're only halfway through, if you can give us your feedback, we'd greatly appreciate it. You will receive an email from the cohorts@tdainc.org email address. That email address is a great resource for you also if you have any questions about the cohort program. but look for an evaluation link from that email address. And we'd love if you participated in that survey. And with that, we will wrap up for today. Bring your remaining lingering questions to the office hours on the 27th. And until then, have a great rest of your week, and we'll see you soon.
Thanks, everybody.